Listen. Close your eyes and just listen. Can you hear it? A sound that no longer exists in our world, a voice that possessed the purity and clarity of a child, yet the power and stamina of a grown man. A voice that could soar through an opera house, executing breathtaking vocal acrobatics with effortless grace, then diminish to a whisper so delicate it could break your heart. This was the voice of the castrato. For nearly 300 years, these voices were the sound of heaven on earth, the pinnacle of musical artistry, the obsession of kings, and the adoration of the masses. But this divine sound was born from a brutal, earthly act. It was purchased at a price that is almost unthinkable to us today, the price of a boy's own body, his future, his very identity. This is not just a story about music, it is a story about ambition, poverty, faith, and cruelty. It's the story of the boys who were sacrificed for song, the angels who were broken to create a perfect sound. This is the story of the Castrati. Our journey begins in the hallowed halls of the church in the late 16th century. The Apostle Paul's edict, mulieres in ecclesias tacent, let women be silent in the churches, was interpreted with absolute literalness. Women were forbidden from singing in church choirs. This created a sonic problem. The high soprano and alto lines, crucial for the soaring polyphony of sacred music, were missing. Initially, the solution was found in falsettists, men who sang in a high, breathy head voice. But falsettos lacked the power and ringing clarity needed to fill the vast cathedrals of Rome and Venice. Another solution was found in boy sopranos. Their voices were pure, angelic, and perfectly suited for sacred music. But they came with a built-in expiration date: puberty. As soon as a boy's voice began to change, his career in the choir was over, his precious gift lost forever. This frustrating cycle of training and losing talent led to a desperate and ultimately horrifying idea. What if puberty could be stopped? What if that perfect prepubescent voice could be preserved indefinitely? The answer lay in a secret, illicit practice that had existed on the fringes of medicine for centuries. Castration, the procedure performed on boys before the age of 10, prevented the larynx from developing. It never dropped. The vocal cords remained short and supple, like a child's. But here is where the terrible magic happened. While the boy's larynx remained small, the rest of his body continued to grow. His lungs, his diaphragm, his rib cage, they all developed to adult size. This created a biological paradox, a child's vocal instrument powered by a man's engine. The result was a voice of unparalleled capabilities. The castrati possessed a lung capacity that was legendary, allowing them to hold notes for astonishing lengths of time, far beyond the ability of any other singer. Their vocal range often spanned 3.5 octaves, seamlessly blending the high notes of a soprano with the rich lower tones of a contralto. Their small, flexible vocal cords allowed for incredible agility, enabling them to execute rapid trills, scales, and embellishments, known as coloratura, with a precision and speed that was considered superhuman. It was a voice that was neither male nor female, but something otherworldly, something angelic. The practice began quietly, in the shadows, but by the early 1600s, castrati were openly employed in the choirs of Italy, most notably in the Sistine Chapel itself. The Church, while officially condemning the act of castration with the threat of excommunication, conveniently looked the other way. They needed these voices. The demand was too great, and where the Church led, secular society followed. The burgeoning art form of opera was taking Italy by storm, and composers quickly realized the dramatic potential of these extraordinary voices. The castrato was perfect for the heroic roles of opera seria, the noble princes, the valiant warriors, the mythological gods. Their powerful, emotive voices could convey a range of feeling that was simply staggering, And so the golden age of the castrati began, from the late 17th to the late 18th century. These singers were the undisputed superstars of the European stage. They were the rock stars of the Baroque era. Their names were spoken with the same reverence we reserve for global icons today. Names like Senesino, Caffarelli, and the most famous of them all, Farinelli, Carlo Broschi. Known to the world as Farinelli, was more than a singer. He was a phenomenon. Born in 1705, he was castrated as a boy after a riding accident was used as a pretext. His talent was undeniable. He possessed a voice of such beauty, power, and technical perfection that audiences were regularly driven to hysterics. Stories of his abilities sound like myths. It was said he could produce 250 notes in a single breath and sustain a note for over a minute. In a famous contest in Rome, he competed against a trumpeter, holding and swelling a note with such purity and power that the professional musician simply gave up in defeat. Farinelli's fame took him across Europe. In London, he became the toast of the town, earning a fortune that would be equivalent to millions of dollars today. Women fainted in the aisles during his performances. One noblewoman famously cried out, "One God, one Farinelli," from her box, a phrase that became legendary. His career took an even more incredible turn when he was summoned to Spain. King Philip V was suffering from a profound, debilitating depression. He refused to speak, to govern, to even leave his darkened room. His wife, Queen Elizabeth Farnese, had heard of Farinelli's miraculous voice and, in desperation, arranged for him to sing in an adjoining chamber. The effect was transformative. The king was so moved, so soothed by the music, that he began to recover. For the next 10 years, Farinelli remained in the Spanish court, not as a public performer, but as a private musician and royal confidant. Every single night, he sang the same 4 arias to the king. He was knighted, given immense political influence, and became one of the most powerful men in Spain, all because of his voice. The lives of these stars were filled with a level of glamour and wealth that was unprecedented for a performer. They commanded enormous fees, were lavished with jewels and estates by their royal patrons, and their every move was chronicled by an adoring public. Composers like George Friedrich Handel, Nicola Porpora, and Johann Adolf Hasse built entire operas around the specific talents of their favorite castrati. The arias they wrote were not just songs, they were athletic and emotional showcases of the highest order, designed to push the human voice to its absolute limits. To attend an opera starring a top castrato was the ultimate social event. It was an experience of overwhelming sensory and emotional intensity. The audience would sit in stunned silence as a singer unleashed a torrent of impossibly fast notes, a messa di voce, where a note would swell from a barely audible pianissimo to a thunderous fortissimo and back again, or a heart-breaking lament that could move the entire theatre to tears. This was the pinnacle of vocal art. It was a sound that seemed to defy the laws of nature. But behind the glittering chandeliers of the opera house, behind the thunderous applause and the adoring crowds, lay a profoundly dark and tragic reality. The journey to becoming a Farinelli was a brutal gamble, and for every star that shone brightly, thousands of others were extinguished in darkness. The process began in poverty. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, it is estimated that up to 4,000 Italian boys a year were subjected to castration for musical purposes. These were not the sons of nobles. They were the children of poor, desperate families who saw the potential of a golden voice as their only ticket out of a life of squalor. They would sell their sons to a maestro or a conservatory, clutching onto the slim hope that their child might become the next superstar. The decision was often framed as a medical necessity, a fall, an illness, a supposed deformity. But everyone knew the truth. It was a transaction, a child's future in exchange for a chance at fortune. The operation itself was a nightmare. It was performed without anesthesia, often in unsanitary conditions by a local barber surgeon who was paid to ask no questions. The boy would be drugged with opium or submerged in a bath of icy water to numb the area. The procedure was quick, brutal, and fraught with danger. Many boys did not survive. They died from infection, from blood loss, or from the shock and trauma of the procedure itself. There were no official records. A failed attempt was simply a tragedy to be buried and forgotten. For those who survived the surgery, the ordeal was just beginning. They were sent to rigorous music conservatories, primarily in Naples, which became the epicenter of castrato production. Their lives were a relentless cycle of practice and discipline. From dawn until dusk, they studied music theory, sight, singing, and above all, vocal technique. They were pushed mercilessly by their teachers, who had a vested financial interest in their success. But the physical operation was no guarantee of musical talent. A boy might survive the knife only to discover he had a mediocre voice, or no aptitude for music at all. These boys were the tragic refuse of a cruel system. With neither the voice to succeed as a castrato, nor the physical development to live a normal life as a man, they were condemned to the margins of society. Many ended up in minor church choirs, earning a pittance. Others, unable to find any other work, were forced into prostitution. They became ghosts, living reminders of a gamble that did not pay off. Even for the successful, life was a complex tapestry of adoration and alienation. Their physical development was markedly different. They grew unusually tall, with abnormally long arms and legs. Their bone structure never fully hardened, leading to a high incidence of osteoporosis later in life. They did not grow facial or body hair, and their skin remained smooth and soft. Many developed gynecomastia, the enlargement of breast tissue. They were, in essence, trapped in a perpetual androgynous adolescence. This physical otherness marked them for life. On stage, they were gods. Off stage, they were often objects of ridicule and suspicion. They were called neuters, capons, third gender. They could never marry in the eyes of the church, never have children of their own, never experience the life of a typical man. Their relationships were complex and often fraught. While some, like Farinelli, found companionship and were admired for their intellect and charm, many others faced a life of profound loneliness. They were surrounded by adoring fans but were fundamentally alone, their bodies a constant public symbol of their sacrifice. The psychological toll must have been immense. To be idolized for the very thing that marked you as a freak, to be celebrated for a voice that was the result of a childhood trauma, to live a life of immense fame and yet profound isolation. It is a paradox that is difficult to fathom. They were living, breathing works of art, but their humanity was often overlooked, their inner suffering ignored in the face of their sublime talent, and the hypocrisy of it all was staggering. The Catholic Church, which held the power of excommunication over anyone involved in the act of castration, was the largest employer of castrati singers. The Sistine Chapel choir was filled with them. This don't ask, don't tell policy allowed the institution to benefit from the angelic voices while condemning the very act that created them. It was a moral corrosion at the heart of the system, a willingness to sacrifice human bodies on the altar of sacred beauty. By the end of the 18th century, the world was changing. The Enlightenment had brought with it new ideas about reason, nature, and the rights of the individual. The rigid, stylized world of opera seria began to feel dated. Tastes were shifting. The public began to favor a more natural style of singing. The heroic tenor, with his full-throated, masculine voice, began to supplant the castrato as the romantic lead. The practice of castration was increasingly seen for what it was, a barbaric mutilation. The social and political upheavals of the era, particularly Napoleon's conquests in Italy, helped to hasten its demise. The French, who had always viewed the castrati with a mixture of fascination and disgust, outlawed the practice in the territories they controlled. The conservatories that had once been factories for these unique voices were shut down or reformed. The supply of new castrati began to dry up. The golden age was over. The great singers of the past retired or faded into obscurity. Opera houses no longer echoed with their otherworldly sound. By the mid-negative 9th century, the castrati had all but vanished from the public stage. They survived only in one last bastion, the church. Specifically, the Vatican's own Sistine Chapel choir, which continued to employ them long after the practice had become a public taboo. And it is here that our story finds its final, haunting chapter. His name was Alessandro Moreschi. Born in 1858, he was one of the very last boys to undergo the operation. Likely around 1865. He joined the Sistine Chapel choir in 1883 and eventually became its director. By the turn of the 20th century, he was a living relic, a remnant of a bygone era. His voice, once the celebrated norm in sacred music, was now a strange and singular curiosity. Moreschi lived just long enough to witness the dawn of a new technology, sound recording. Between 1902 and 1904, a man named Fred Gaisberg from the Gramophone and Typewriter Company in London traveled to Rome to capture the sounds of the Sistine Chapel choir. He recorded Alessandro Moreschi, both solo and with the choir. For the first and only time in history, the voice of a castrato was captured, etched into wax. Moreschi became known as l'Angelo di Roma, the Angel of Rome. In 1913 he retired, and he died in 1922, the last of his kind. With his death, a sound that had defined European music for centuries went silent forever. Or did it? Because of those crude, scratchy recordings, we have a ghost, we have an echo. Let's listen to a fragment of one of those recordings now. This is Alessandro Moreschi singing the Crucifixus from Rossini's Petite Messe Solennelle. Audio clip of Moreschi singing would play. Here, what are we hearing? It's important to understand the context. The recording quality is primitive. It's noisy, distorted, and captures only a fraction of the true vocal timbre. Furthermore, Moreschi was in his mid-40s when he made these recordings, well past his prime. He was by all accounts not one of the great virtuosos of the Golden Age, and his style of singing was considered old-fashioned and overly emotional, even at the time. Yet, through the crackle and hiss, something of that unique quality comes through. You can hear the high flute, like timbre, a sound that is clearly not a female soprano or a male falsettist. You can hear the hints of power, the strange, disembodied purity. There is a sob, a catch in the voice, that is deeply human and unsettling. It is the sound of a lost world. It is the only direct evidence we have of what Farinelli or Senesino might have sounded like. It is a flawed, imperfect, but priceless historical document. It is the voice of the last angel. So what is the legacy of the castrati? It is a legacy of profound contradiction. They were the creators of some of the most sublime and beautiful music ever conceived. They advanced the art of singing to a level of technical and emotional virtuosity that has arguably never been surpassed. They were artists of the highest caliber who left an indelible mark on the history of Western culture. But they were also victims. Victims of poverty, of ambition, of religious dogma, and of an aesthetic that valued a perfect sound over a whole human being. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What price is acceptable for great art? Where is the line between sacrifice and mutilation? How can we reconcile the exquisite beauty of their music with the brutal reality of its creation? We can never hear them as their original audiences did. We can never sit in a candlelit opera house and be overwhelmed by the sheer, unearthly power of Farinelli's voice. That sound is gone, and perhaps it is for the best. It belongs to a world with different values, a different understanding of the body, of art, and of humanity. But we must not forget them. To listen to the music Handel wrote for Senesino, to read the accounts of Farinelli's triumphs, to hear the faint, ghostly echo of Moreschi's voice on that old recording, is to remember. It is to remember the glory and the tragedy. It is to acknowledge that the most heavenly sounds can sometimes spring from the most earthly pain. The silence they left behind is as powerful as the music they made. It is a silence filled with the ghosts of 4,000 boys a year, a silence that asks us to contemplate the true cost of beauty and to remember the angels who were broken for a song.